Grab your favorite caffeinated beverage and get cozy because you are listening to Mindful as a Mother with Paige Bruce and Lindsay Adams.
Hey everyone, Lindsay and I are very excited to announce that we are currently prepping a brand new video series. This series is for the parents frustrated by navigating the emotional roller coaster of their children. So many times we hear my kid goes from 0 to 60 so quick, there's nothing I can do and I'm not sure how to handle it. Well, this video series is for you. We're going to walk through what it is to have this type of emotional experience and when to offer compassion, connection, and support. We're also going to walk you through skills to teach yourself and your children to help you manage these emotions. If you want to be the first to know when this comes out, very soon, check out the link in our show notes to sign up for that newsletter. Thanks, guys.
This podcast is not intended to be a substitute for therapy or the therapeutic relationship, and the information given in this podcast is purely for educational purposes and is not intended to replace the advice of a professional. Hello and welcome back to Mindful as a Mother. My name is Lindsay and I'm here with Paige and a very special guest. First, Paige, say hi.
Hello, everyone.
And we are here with, I'm going to try and say your last name correctly, Olivia Silvana.
Yes.
Oh, yay, I did it. I've only read it, never said it out loud. So
yeah, it's actually my middle name because my last name isn't cute. So we use my middle name for all my stuff.
I love it. I love it.
Does it have a meaning?
We like, what?
Does your middle name have a meaning? Now I'm curious.
No, it's my mom's first name. I guess it's kind of like popular in Italy. It's like an Italian name. It's weird.
I'm here for it.
I like it.
Yeah.
It means something. It's cool.
Yeah.
We like to let people introduce themselves on here. So tell us about yourself. Who are you? What do you do?
Yeah. So I am an ADHD educator, coach, all the things, I feel like at this point, but I used to be a school psychologist. And even though I don't practice it, I still have, my certification for that and everything. So, I've worked in a school system for over 10 years, with individuals that had all different, and I know you ladies know this, but different disabilities to help them kind of understand and staff and like parents and even themselves like understand, oh hey, like I have this, here's the challenges that come with it, and here's how we can all like navigate it and work together to help support children, teens, adolescents in just succeeding academically. And I was diagnosed with ADHD late in life, ironically, after working with a lot of kids that had ADHD. And that's kind of what fueled my passion from going to being a school psychologist to then diving more into specializing in ADHD and specifically helping women with ADHD.
I love that. I think there are so many of us in and around our generation that are being diagnosed late in life, right, with ADHD. And I know Lindsay has a similar story, and I would love to hear your story about how you decided to seek a diagnosis or why.
Yeah. So ironically, as I was working in a school as a school psychologist, I actually hit clinical burnout, which is just basically a really severe form of being burnt out, right? I got to a point where I couldn't function anymore. So it kind of almost feels like you're in a depression, and they did diagnose me with a situational depression at first. So they were, sorry. Wait. Come here, little girl. I thought I could put her down. I could not. So, I was diagnosed with situational depression. They had put me on an SSRI, which I was totally open to, right? Whatever's going to help me feel better, because I couldn't function. Like I could barely go to work or anything like that. And didn't know what was wrong with me. I was like, what is wrong with me? Like, why can't I function? Why am I feeling this way? And like maybe 3 years before that, I would joke around with my friends and be like, guys, I think I have ADHD. Like, I work with these kids, like I do these evaluations, I tick the box on a lot of these things, but my consequences of continuing to let it go and let it go and let it go until I hit that burnout. And I had a rare side effect. It's like 1% of the population that ever experiences this on the SSRI medication, where I almost ended up in the ER. Yeah. And I found out that had I continued to take it, I could have ended up like in a coma. It's like potentially life threatening. So they took me off that. And that's when I knew enough to be like, okay, I don't think this is really depression. Like, yes, I think that's what I'm experiencing, but I think that I might have ADHD and I think that this is what's causing it. And my doctors at the time were like, well, what other things were you experiencing before the burnout? And so when I told them, they were like, you actually might. So let's get you an evaluation. And I went through like a proper evaluation. I think I spoke to 2 different people. Like I went through 2 full evaluations and they were like, oh yeah, you definitely have ADHD and this is why you hit a burnout. And I was like, oh, great, fabulous. So here we
My
are.
story, yeah, my story is very similar to that. And so I can relate on a deep level of like, you have this clinical knowledge, and because the way we were educated, or at least the way I was in school, was like, it's 8-year-old boys, like that's what you're taught that ADHD looks like, is like hyperactive, running around, that I didn't really connect. I always thought I had anxiety because of like the mental hyperactivity, and I didn't, and I have trauma. So it was like this weird bag, but it was like, I started to suspect it. And then the more I explored it, I was like, oh, okay. And I remember the first time I actually took ADHD meds, it was like life changing. I was like, oh my gosh, this is how my brain maybe is supposed to feel. It's wild to me.
Yeah, I felt the same way when I first tried medication too. I was like, whoa. It just like calmed everything down. And I was like, this is interesting because, I experienced a lot of anxiety before any of that. Like I was getting panic attacks and stuff. So, um, you know, they say a lot of women, especially adult women, are diagnosed with anxiety or depression or both before ADHD is even considered, when ADHD usually is the root cause of the anxiety and the depression.
That's interesting. I totally believe that.
Yeah.
What is an ADHD coach and how do you help people?
Yeah. So an ADHD coach, and everyone kind of functions in their own light to this, right? But overall, like in general, is just someone who helps you with the barriers that are specific to ADHD. So things like time management, executive functioning skills, stress management that comes with that, emotional regulation, because that's a huge part that comes with ADHD that can be challenging. And, helping you kind of navigate those day-to-day challenges that can come with those things, right? So how it impacts your relationships, work, self-esteem, and kind of just like help you get to that point of like, okay, this is kind of getting in my way. This is where I'm feeling stuck with this specific thing to my ADHD. What can I do to overcome it and to work through it? So it's really just giving you those tools to kind of help figure out what works for you, what helps you, and create that ADHD friendly lifestyle.
I love that. And I've been making some content on this lately about how it it never ceases to blow my mind how many providers out there are not educated on neurodivergence. And it's not necessarily their fault, because what we were taught in school, and I know for myself, a majority of the education I've gotten has been me seeking it out and doing it for myself, because my son was diagnosed with autism pretty much, right? Like, and that's when I like opened the floodgates of like, oh, everything they told me in school is either outdated, incorrect, or not helpful. And so then that like expanded the ADHD, and I got my diagnosis, and it's just been a whole like, holy cow. I still have clients come to me and say they have a hard time finding a provider that actually understands neurodivergence. And it's just, I'm so glad that there's people out there like you, who you have a clinical background, but you're also like a coach who can help people in the way that they need, because there isn't many people that understand it.
Yeah, and that's such a good point to make, because I've had clients before who have had like other providers and support who didn't or weren't, specifically trained on ADHD or neurodivergence. And didn't really understand why certain things were challenging for them. So didn't know how to like kind of help support them through those barriers. And like, even for me, like I was kind of taught on all of that as a school psychologist. I know my schooling is a little different than like the regular like therapy track, but even for me, like I had to, I got my certification as an ADHD educator specifically because there's just so much more updated information, especially in the last year, that I wasn't taught either. And so the more that I started to see, the more I was like, wow. And I've actually now expanded and dipped into helping train other people who don't have that to be neurodivergent informed, because it's going to be so important moving forward, regardless of what people do, any kind of service that they provide, a course or whatever, to make sure that they're kind of meeting all the different needs depending on how their client's brain functions, to make sure that they're supporting them.
Yeah. And I hope that the like education system catches up, because I remember when I was in grad school, like a real long time ago, I'm really old, but the focus was to being trauma informed. And like, I hope that now that we're all trauma informed, like on some level, like people are getting that, even the school system a little bit, like now we can shift, like we need to be neurodivergent informed or like neurodiverse informed or whatever words you want to use. Like we need to add that to, because it's a necessary thing to take into account when working with people.
I agree. And this really came up for me, and it comes up, I think, in my clinical practice, that I see a lot of women, right? And I specialize in ADHD and anxiety in all humans. So that's kids, but also a lot of adults. Like I see a lot of middle-aged women similar to all of us. And it comes up for me often, the members of the treatment.
Did you just call me middle-aged?
I mean, we're technically not middle-aged till we're 50, but I was like, what's the way to say like this large window of like mid 20 to like 50? But so I'll be discussing things with them and they're like, oh, my psychiatrist said I have anxiety or I have PTSD, and like, it can be really complicated and all these things and symptoms matched in. And then I'm finding myself feeling the need, not that my client makes me, but I feel the need to say, like, I don't want to battle your psychiatrist. And I think it's worth exploring because of these things you've shared with me. It's like, would you be comfortable doing a general screener? Because I have so many people that I work with who are like, well, I tried this antidepressant, I tried this anti-anxiety, and I tried this and this, and it's like, it doesn't feel like it's working. And I'm having a hard time, organizing or making choices, or financially, I can't get my life together. And I feel so overwhelmed because all these things are happening at once and I can't ever sleep. And I'm like, okay, so there's a lot that this could be. And I think this is an avenue we haven't explored, but I realize that I feel the need to say that caveat of like, I'm not trying to challenge, like, I don't want you to fight your psychiatrist, right? That's not my goal here. But I'm also wanting to advocate because I have run into a lot of pushback from other providers of like, no, you don't have ADHD, you have anxiety. And I'm like, okay, regardless of label, these are the symptoms we're experiencing. The medication that you have been taking doesn't feel like it's supporting you. Like you still have problems with your daily functioning that you feel like need resolved. And so it's just this really weird space. I feel like, and Lindsay and I talk about this a lot, because I want to advocate for my client and what's best for my client, but I also don't want them to feel like they need to be challenging or I'm challenging their psychiatrist. And then there's like this whole other window of imposter syndrome before you have like a formal assessment of like, I say this to Lindsay all the time because currently I'm unmedicated, but I was like, I woke up today and I thought maybe I don't have ADHD and I'm just frauding every person on the internet that reads my content. And she just like laughed at me really hard and was like, no.
Or I give her the space. I'm like, really? We're doing this again? Like, and then we talk through it.
Yeah. The reality of that though is so real. Like that feeling like a fraud for many of us with ADHD is so real. I mean, I dip in and out of that sometimes too. And I have like a diagnosis for years now. And I'm still like, maybe it's not ADHD.
Yes,
know?
I have many friends that are around my age and that have kids that mention that they are afraid to go in and get an assessment because they're afraid that they'll tell them that they don't have ADHD. And then it's like, well, what's happening for me? And I read this thing when I was doing some study, and I can't remember where it came from, but it really hit home when it talked about how we so naturally, when you're neurodivergent, your brain is wired differently. You naturally mask and come up with hacks, etc., right, to be successful and accomplish the things you need to accomplish if you don't have the education or opportunity for someone to teach you built-in skills. And a lot of times in motherhood, when we become mothers, we end up with these needs and like the emotional capacity that kids need and the organization that it needs, that those skills or coping skills or things that we had developed to hack life prior to that, like we have so many needs that it outweighs our resources. And that's when we're like, there's a problem. I'm really struggling. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, like that's such a good point. And I think too, like the fear of being dismissed really stops a lot of women from moving forward to, getting an assessment or an evaluation. Like for me, what I don't understand is like what is the harm in giving someone an assessment? It doesn't mean that you're giving them a diagnosis, but like at least give them the proper means to having an evaluation to rule it out, rule it in, rule it out, whichever, it doesn't hurt anyone to do that. And I think that's the hardest part with just like the healthcare system in general, because a lot of like regular medical providers, again, have that old school thought of, well, if you weren't diagnosed as a child and you did well in school, you can't have ADHD. That was my first experience too. I got dismissed at first and I was like, nope, you're wrong. Next, you know? So yeah. I always tell women too that I've worked with, I'm like, look, like if you want to get a second opinion, it's okay to get a second opinion.
Yeah. And another layer of being a woman with ADHD that I know Paige and I have been diving into and you know a lot about is how your cycle impacts your ADHD symptoms. And so can you tell us a little bit about that? And for selfish reasons, because I want to know what I can do to better help myself throughout the different phases of my cycle.
Yeah. So, I guess I'll start with like the first part in like how it impacts our ADHD symptoms, because even for me, like I didn't know this for the longest time, right? Until I started to learn more about it and actually like went through a training on it. And, there's still a lot of research that's being done around this topic, just like so everyone knows there's still a lot of like little pieces that they're kind of trying to like put together. But a lot of current research, shows that strong correlation between our hormone cycle and our ADHD symptoms. So, we have those two main hormones, which is estrogen and progesterone, and they fluctuate throughout our cycle, right? And they play a huge role in regulating our dopamine levels in our brain. And so for those of us with ADHD, our dopamine is already, lower and less available. So when we have certain dips in our estrogen and it's impacting our dopamine on top of that, that's where our ADHD symptoms can be more exacerbated or harder to manage. And so some women might already notice this in themselves, and others might be like, oh my goodness, wait, like I need to start paying attention to this after they hear this, because unless you feel it kind of intensely, you might not notice that it's necessarily happening for you.
Yeah, I would say I was pretty unaware of it until I like paid closer attention to what was happening during my cycle and and then I realized like I'd get in this pattern where during my like luteal phase and my menstrual phase, I would think like my meds aren't working. My meds are not working. Like, and then like get back and I'm like, oh no, I was just exaggerating or whatever. I talk myself out of it. But then after learning this, I realized like, oh no, this is because the symptoms get so much worse for me during that time period.
Yeah. And so what's happening too is like, so during the first half of our cycle is our follicular phase, right? So during those first 2 weeks, our estrogen levels are rising, and this can typically have more of a positive effect on our ADHD. So we might feel like, because our estrogen is increasing the dopamine levels in our brain, right? So we might feel more productive, alert, focused with having ADHD, right? So keeping that in mind, we're still not functioning like a neurotypical, but in regards to our own symptoms, we might actually feel like, wow, I could get more done. I could take more on my plate. It's, some people call it like the honeymoon phase. And then we hit that wall where, like you were saying, the luteal phase, right? Which happens after ovulation, where estrogen levels start to go down and start to dip, but our progesterone starts to rise in the very beginning. And so what happens is, as our estrogen is going down, right, we can have more like mood swings, fatigue, harder time regulating our emotions, which can come with like typical like PMS symptoms. But for those of us with ADHD, we feel the severity of that much more because of the impact on the dopamine levels, right? And so as progesterone levels go up too, that can actually increase symptoms that are more like anxiousness or irritability, brain fog, because estrogen and progesterone kind of like function in different ways. So some women, like keeping this in mind that we're all different. So some women might feel certain symptoms more than others. And I think for me, knowing, it's almost like clockwork for me now. Like I know when it's going to happen, and I almost can tell you when it's going to be at its worst.
How long does it take you to like create that awareness around your cycle, do you think? Because I feel like I'm getting there, but I'm not quite there yet. And every like luteal phase, I'm like, oh, I wish I could like predict this a little better. And I know something that you do is like schedule and plan around your cycle. And so I'm just curious how long it took you, and then what other tips you have for kind of managing this.
Yeah, so it definitely took a while. I would say just understanding my own patterns, it probably took a good like 3 months or so of just kind of like, and again, like I intentionally like I used an app. I started to track like where I was in my phase. And I would actually note down, the app that I use is like the most helpful because you could put your symptoms like in the app. But at first I was writing it down, like what I was feeling during which part. And it does still shift a little, right? But I overall know, okay, like I'm dipping into this luteal phase. My energy is going to go first. Just for me, that's how it happens. Then I start to get spacey. And then at some point in my luteal phase, before I get my period and start bleeding, is when it gets kind of like really bad for me. But it kind of got to the point of, I would say, if you haven't done it yet at all, give yourself at least 3 months to see like what your patterns are. I don't know how long you've been doing it for, but at least 3 months, see where your patterns are. And then when you kind of see that, then you can kind of start to be like, okay, during this like week is where I could kind of start to lighten my load a little bit. And then maybe you'll start to see like where it's kind of at its worst. But I would say it probably takes a good like 6 months. I know that takes a while, but it does. I think the awareness is like the first key. So I would say like before anyone does any of the other things that I'll mention, track. Like start tracking, start noticing your symptoms during each part, even the good parts, right? I always tell people like, don't just focus on like, oh, this is really terrible for me right now. I feel like I'm having an existential crisis. Focus on where it's good too. Like, oh, I'm really productive. I have so much more energy here. I could take on a little bit more, because then you can start to figure out after that piece, like, okay, how can I manage my like work and life schedule to kind of like work around that?
You use the Stardust app, correct?
Yeah, I love that one.
I I love that one too. That's what I use as well. And I love it because their symptoms, they have like so many different, they take everything into account, like your mood, your hunger levels, like anxiety, anything like that. And so it's really helpful because it is really detailed, and there's like a notes thing at the bottom when you track, which is nice. Then you can just throw the notes in about your ADHD. I know someone will ask this question. So how does birth control affect this?
Yeah. So I am actually on it. So I kind of have like firsthand experience. Um, it depends what kind of birth control you're on too, because, you know, if you're on hormonal birth control versus not hormonal birth control, this is going to make a difference. Some people will actually go on hormonal birth control to kind of mitigate some of their symptoms. For me, like I have PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. They kind of are suggesting I stay on it to kind of mitigate some of those symptoms, because I do have, it's basically like PMS times 20, you know, it's just much more intense feelings of PMS. And so even though I'm on it, I still go through the same cycle phases. So I know a lot of people are like, oh, well, if I'm on like, you know, hormonal birth control, doesn't that mean that like I'm not going to go through these phases? But that's not true, because your body is still going through it, even though you're on hormonal birth control. And some people will be like, well, I just track my cycle through my, like if people are on the pill or whatever, they're like, I just track it that way. I would still use an app, because sometimes things can shift depending on, you know, what that looks like for you. And like, if you get off of it, right, if you decide to get off, you're on it, you decide to get off of it, you kind of want to know where your cycle is in general, without that being like, oh, I'm just relying on this thing that I'm on that I might not always be on. So I would say, like, even if you're on any type of birth control, still track your cycle, because you're going to see fluctuations.
What about women that don't have a cycle? Is there a way for them to start tracking? Because I was reading a book. We read tons of books all the time, right? But I was reading this book, and this functional medicine doctor was talking about how we know vital signs for women, or vital signs for humans in general, like, oh, are you breathing? Do you have a heart rate? Like all those things, right? Basic vital signs for life. And then women, one basic vital sign for us and being aware of our wellness is our cycle. And I thought that that was really powerful, and how little I think even I knew about it before I started diving the research in, right? Like, you know, some basics, if you're lucky enough to know, like, oh, I'm gonna bleed, but like these phrases like luteal phase or follicular phase, like all the things. I think there's so many of us that are experiencing symptoms that we don't understand those concepts or where to even start.
Yeah, and that's such a good question, because like if you don't get a cycle, like let's say you've gone through menopause or you've gotten a hysterectomy or like something like that, your body is functioning much different than a woman that has a cycle, right? And I know a little bit about this. I'm not like a full blown like, you know, I'd love to know more about this, so I will be like transparent. That, you know, I know that it is different. And women that are going through perimenopause, which is like a whole nother thing. We could probably do a whole nother interview just on that. I do have this in my workshop that I did on this, but you know, as we go through that, our ADHD is also impacted through that whole thing as well. And it's definitely something for women to talk to their medical provider about if they're not, because if they're not having those hormones, right, they're not going through those fluctuations, they might still be experiencing other symptoms because of, you know, that lack of having a hormonal cycle, and they might need some other things in place to help them that's out of their control.
I want to go back to the PMDD for a minute, because this is not scientific at all, but I swear one day someone will scientifically say there's a connection between ADHD and PMDD.
Well, there is research around it that like, I want to say my ADHD and forgetting percentages right now. It's like 50 something percent of women with ADHD are more likely to have PMDD than women without ADHD.
Yeah, because
And there's still Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, I think part of it is the mood piece, right? The mood piece of ADHD with the hormone fluctuations.
Yeah, you know, this is a part where they're still doing more research around, and I would love to see like what ends up happening in the next like couple of years, because as someone with PMDD, and not knowing that, right? Like before I even knew I had ADHD or PMDD, like I think when I was younger, my mom would always be like, you have PMDD, like there's something wrong with you, and I'd be like, okay, like I was a kid, I didn't know any better. And then as I got older, I did notice I had very intense emotional like dysregulation once a month. And I would start to be like, is this normal? Like, am I going crazy? Like, you start to think all these things. So on top of not knowing that I had ADHD and on top of not understanding PMDD, I was like, literally, and a lot of women with ADHD already feel like there's something seriously wrong with us, right? So it's like, oh, it was like so exacerbated. So once I understood all this stuff about me, it's been a lot easier to be like, okay, like, I have both of these things that, can play significantly off of each other. And even for women with ADHD that just experience PMS, it could still be pretty intense because of the dopamine fluctuations and how strongly impact estrogen impacts that as well. So it's just rough for us.
Yeah. And I noticed in myself, like around that, like the end of my luteal phase and right before I start my period, my mood is like my thoughts get very dark. It's almost like very depression like. And the rejection, like sensitive dysphoria piece is like on 10. Like Paige and I kind of joke about it because, in the online world, you get the comments. And I know you've gotten like some crazy people DMing you lately saying like very, very mean stuff to you. But I I take it so personally, and then the other like phases in my cycle, I'm like, oh, whatever. So sometimes I'll text Paige and I'll be like, I'm in my luteal phase. I need you to respond to this person because it can't be me because I'll just be crying or like yelling at them.
Yeah. And I think that that's such a great point to make, right? Especially for those of us that might have it more intensely, like, because I can relate to you. It's that like couple of days before I bleed, I have the most intrusive thoughts. I have existential crisis. Like, I'm like, what is life? What is the point of existing? Like, it can get very dark. And a lot of people don't talk about this because, there's still like stigma around this kind of stuff. But I know that like specifically when I'm in those moments, I reach out to someone, and like I'm super tearful. I'll cry on and off for no reason. Like there's no logical reason to the way that I'm feeling, but I'll reach out to like someone that's like a safe space for me and be like, hey, like I'm feeling this way. I don't know how to get out of it. I can't like do it on my own. And I think that that's one of the most powerful things for women with ADHD to have is to have safe spaces because we can't always do it alone. And I think that that's like one of the hardest things for us is to ask for help. But I can't tell you how much of a difference that has made for me, especially when I'm in those places where it's hard to navigate. And like, I can relate to you so much, Lindsay, because like when I was getting that like mean comment, it always happens during my luteal phase. And I'm like, but why right now? Because like I want to like jump through the screen, like I'm a human. But then I have to like contact like one of my friends that can like bring me back and just be like, Olivia, come back. It's not worth your energy. It's not worth your time, like this, that, and the other. But normally I could just brush it off. So it's really interesting how it can impact so many parts for us.
Yeah. And I want to just bring up for all of our listeners and our audience that this can like verge into the realm of woo-woo, as we like to call it, but it's not. I think there's so much stigma around being a woman and talking about our menstrual cycles and bleeding openly with the impact of them, that it's like, oh, if you try to schedule your life and energy and tasks around your period, then you're like this holistic hippie goddess, which I hope to the universe I am someday. But like, that's not true. Like, this is just actual evidence, actual experiences of a human experience for females and it's so important to know and to talk about and to be willing to understand like isn't something that's just made up that we wanted to get hyped about as women, like feminists. Like, yes, I'm a feminist, and yes, I experience a period, and this is real. Like, it's important to know. And so I just wanted to bring that up because I feel like so many times we don't talk about it, and we get caught in the rhetoric that at least I was raised with, like, oh, you're just a woman, it's that time of the month, no wonder you're being such a B word, like all the things. And it's like, okay, actually, like, these are normal experiences. There's nothing wrong with you. Like, this is how you fluctuate and why and how to use it, and that there's a gift in every phase.
And
Yeah.
it's science. It is science. That's where I'm like, it's science, guys. Like, we just don't want to acknowledge because the periods make people uncomfortable.
Yeah. And, it's funny because like my most recent internet troll was triggered by me talking about the reality of hormones and ADHD. And I'm going to assume that this person has a lot of shame around their own experiences, around their hormonal cycle and their ADHD. So when I'm talking about it in a reality, like, hey, here's what I experience, here's what I do, to help myself. It's not to be like, oh, here's all these issues that you have with your ADHD. It's like, here's the reality of what you're likely experiencing or can experience. But here's also what you can do to help support yourself and manage it. Because yes, we have challenges. We go through these things that maybe other people don't experience. And there's still another side to like, here's how to feel better. And if we're not talking about the hard stuff, how do we get to the feeling better part? And I think that that's really important, especially when it comes to hormones, because a lot of women are shamed around this part to not speak about. So how ironic is it that someone's trying to shame me to not speak about it? And I'm like, no, I'm going to continue because I know how shamed I felt about it for most of my life.
And I think just the awareness, like you're doing so much good by just bringing the awareness to people. Because for me, it's like, now that I have this awareness, I know that the hard part, the dark thoughts, because when you're in it, if you've never experienced something like this, it's hard to describe how deep and dark and permanent it can feel. And but now that I have this awareness, I still have the deep and dark, but I can like have this little voice that's like, okay, it's just your luteal phase. This will pass. This will pass. This will pass. And it's like enough to make it like I can get through it. The other thing that really helps me is my husband is very great and very gentle and very aware of like where I'm at. And so he can sometimes notice it before I can. And that pisses me off, one. But then I have to like check myself because he's not being like, oh, you're about to start your period. But it's a very loving, like, hey, I've noticed you're this. I'm just curious. How close are you to your period? And then I'll be like, it's not just my period, but it absolutely is my period. But I think it's that shame, right? Because as women, we have this shame of like, you're on your period, even when he's not intending it to be that way.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a great point to make too. And if you have a partner, like, so powerful for them to also understand your cycle and where you are, because of that, right? Like, hey, by the way, like kind of like I have friends that, I don't have a partner, but I have friends that are like, Olivia, I notice, like, and I'm like, yep, it's that time. Thank you. Here we are.
The Stardust app too, and I think this is in the features because I don't think I paid for Stardust. Maybe, I don't know, but you can send it to your partner, so they can like link to your cycle, so they can see. Or you could even send it to like a friend if you wanted to, or Paige, I'm going to send you mine so we can like sync our cycles as like business partners. But so you can see where people are at, and I think that really helps like build the support network too. If so that if you're struggling, someone else will like be aware, or they know that you're like in that phase.
Yeah. I think that's what I love most about that app, because like I have like my business like mentor on there, like, so she can see where I'm at. So like whenever we schedule like a workshop or something that I'm doing, we're mindful of like where I am in my cycle. So it's not during my like, spiral, because it's important. And I think that that's like the number one tool is like going back to that awareness, kind of like what you said before, Lindsay, of like, well, I'm aware that it's happening. It doesn't make what I'm experiencing necessarily go away. It just makes it like, oh, I know why this is happening right now. And I know it's not me. Like, it's not a character flaw. It's literally my chemistry in my body, like doing its thing. And here's what I have control over, and here's what I don't, kind of a thing.
Yeah, it really helps reframe it. We so appreciate you coming on and talking about this. Can you tell us where to find you, what your website is, what classes you have, all the things?
Yeah. And I did want to just note before I step into that, just like some of the other things, like besides the awareness, just for anyone that's listening. And it's probably stuff where you're going to be like, oh, okay, like I get it. But like kind of going back to those basics of like movement, like things that have helped me just like in my cycle and throughout. And I know consistency with ADHD can be hard, right? So it's just like doing your best to like try to get in some movement as much as you can. Paige, I know you do your walks and stuff like that. And I've been doing that now too, because it's like, it's just so like, it does make an impact on us. Like any kind of movement, it doesn't have to be like in a gym or anything like that. Mindfulness, I know you guys talk about this a lot with like your moms and kids and stuff like that, and sleep, which I know is another like double-edged sword for people with ADHD, but it's like just trying to like get better with your sleep. And just being mindful of those things, because it does impact our cycle. Like it can make our cycle worse or better depending on what we're doing leading up to those parts.
Yeah, it's so important, and sunlight that is important for me too. And the hardest time to implement it, I think, is that phase when I need it the most. So now I have that awareness too of like, okay, if I'm having a hard time doing these things, I need to do something because I need it more than I am aware of.
Yeah. And we come up with skills and hacks. So it's like, yeah, we're giving you this list of things that are going to support you, but there's like skills and hacks around it. So like I exercise regularly, but I joined a workout class with a supportive female community, and that provides a dopamine booster reward for me, just being in there and like being a smart ass with the other women in the class. And then I work out and I'm like, okay, I'm here, I did it. And then I get the other benefits. But it's like, that's what that little caveat there is what helps me keep going in the phase when it feels really hard to go, or I feel really tired. It's like, okay, it feels good to be with these people. Or budgeting in those sun walks where I'm like, hey, I don't really want to go outside, but I'm in walking distance to a coffee shop. So I was like, I'm going to walk in the sun to the coffee shop and get myself a coffee. And then I'm already there and I'm already doing it. Right. So like some kind of, and Lindsay and I talk specifically about that as like dopamine bookends, right?
Yeah.
Or dopamine loading, like we're getting it up to carry us through.
Yep.
Like those types of things.
Yeah, it's like finding those catalysts, right? And like for me too, it's like if I just put headphones on with music, like I will get up and go. But if I don't, like I'll just keep pushing it off. So it's just finding what your like catalysts are to like doing the thing that you aren't going to want to do.
Yes. Well, even yesterday, I've texted Lindsay all the time. I was like, I'm in my power phase. So now I'm coming to the end of like my energy phase. My estrogen is falling. My progesterone is rising because I'm about to ovulate. And so I'm like, I'm not feeling top energy, but we have a push of things that we need to get done, or I needed to get done before I can let myself exist in a low energy state. And so yesterday I was like, I am 10,000% aware that if I go to my office to try to complete this task, I'm going to end up laying on my couch wrapped in a fuzzy blanket with the lights off. Like I know that. And so instead of going straight to my office, I went to a local spot that I love. Again, a coffee shop, no judgment anywhere, coffee shop. And I sat there for the hour that I was there. And then I was more motivated to get the things done. And I did. And then I was like, I got it done. I'm so proud of me. But I knew because of where I'm at, that if I had gone into my normal routine, I would have avoided it. So I had to create a caveat for myself.
Yeah. Yeah. I think those things are just so powerful for us. The more that we can like figure out what those things are for us. I'm a coffee shop girl too. So when you're saying that, I'm like, yes, give me all the coffee shops, please. But yeah, so, I I just think those little things are helpful. And then like you can move from there. I always tell people like, don't do too much at once of any of this. Like just awareness is like the first part, and then go from there.
Yes. So tell us, where are you? Where can we find you? What can we buy from you? How can we buy it, please? Can we talk again? I love this.
Yes, we can talk whenever. I'm down for that. Yeah, so I mean, my main like social media hub right now is Instagram, which is I am Olivia Silvana. So that's where I have like most of my stuff right now. I do have a website which is on my Instagram, but it's oliviasilvana.com, where like all of my services are. I do have a workshop specifically on hormones and ADHD that kind of goes through not just your cycle, but pregnancy, childbirth, perimenopause, menopause, kind of like the whole lifespan of our hormones and how we can transition, and just what to be aware of. And I also do and am still doing one-on-one coaching for women with ADHD. And I've kind of made it so, I mean, I know you ladies know this, where it's a little more like accessible, where it's like you can just do session by session, and I have a sliding scale available for those, depending on your financial situation. So
I love that. That's so awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming, and we can't wait to have you back. I'm sure we can have like 10 episodes talking about this stuff with you.
Oh yeah, I can only imagine how many episodes we could have on all this. So thank you, ladies, though. It's just such an important topic. So I'm really glad that I got to, share what I know.
Thanks for coming to Mindful as a Mother podcast. If you'd like more of us and Mindful as a Mother, you can find Paige at Instagram at Parenting with Paige, and Lindsay at Linz_Adams LCSW. Find us on TikTok, Instagram, and in our Facebook group, Creating Community and Smashing Parental Stigma, Embracing Mindful Motherhood and Positive Parenting. Thanks so much, and see you next time.